The morning mist clung to the shooting range like a shroud, and Maya Chen could taste the metallic tang of ammunition in the air before she even stepped out of her battered Honda Civic, 27 years old, with calloused hands that spoke of countless hours gripping cold steel. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to make every motion count. The Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy sprawled before her like a concrete monument to authority, its beige walls scarred by decades of California sun, and the echoing reports of 10,000 practice rounds. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. The invitation had come through unofficial channels, a whispered conversation. In the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, where Deputy Marcus Webb had slid a business card across the rain-slicked hood of her car. "Show them what you can do," he'd said, his weathered face creased with something between hope and desperation. "Show them you belong." Maya's fingers found the familiar weight of her grandfather's Colt .45 in its worn leather holster. The weapon had been her inheritance, passed down from Chin Wei-ming, who had served in the Korean War with a precision that had saved more lives than it had taken. The grip bore the smooth indentations of 3 generations of hands, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before a shot, Maya swore she could feel the steady pulse of all those who had held it before her. The betting had started. Before dawn, Sergeant Morrison stood at the center of a cluster of 12 Rangers, his barrel chest straining against his tactical vest as he counted bills with the practiced ease of a casino dealer. At 52, Morrison commanded respect through a combination of genuine skill and carefully cultivated intimidation. His reputation preceded him like the rumble of distant thunder. 30 years in law enforcement, decorated marksman, and the kind of old-school authority figure who believed that some traditions were worth preserving, no matter the cost. "10 grand says the girl chokes," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the range with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything that mattered. "Hell, I'll give her credit. She might hit the target. But bullseyes? Under pressure? With all of us watching?" He shook his head, a patronizing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Not a chance in hell." The money piled up like fallen leaves. Crisp hundreds and worn 20s, emergency funds, and weekend beer money, all riding on the assumption that Maya Chen would crumble under the weight of their collective skepticism. Deputy James "Hawk" Rodriguez, Morrison's second-in-command, added his contribution with a theatrical flourish. "Easy money," he declared, though something in his dark eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Deputy Sarah Martinez stood apart from the betting circle, her arms crossed as she watched Maya check her equipment with methodical care. At 29, Martinez had clawed her way up through the ranks by being twice as good as her male counterparts and half as likely to complain about the obstacles placed in her path. She recognized something familiar in Maya's posture, the quiet determination of someone who had learned to let their actions speak louder than their words. "You sure about this, Chen?" Martinez called out, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "It's not too late to walk away." Maya looked up from adjusting her shooting stance, her dark eyes reflecting the morning light like polished obsidian. "I didn't come here to walk away," she replied, her voice steady despite the electricity that seemed to crackle in the desert air around them. The Riverside facility had been constructed in 1987, during the height of California's expansion of law enforcement training programs. What had once been a state-of-the-art facility now showed the wear of nearly 4 decades of use. The concrete barriers bore the scars of countless ricochets, and the metal target stands had been repaired and reinforced so many times they resembled patchwork quilts of steel and rust. But the fundamentals remained sound: measured distances, standardized targets, and the kind of controlled environment where skill could be separated from luck with mathematical precision. Maya had spent 6 Months preparing for this moment, though she hadn't known it at the time. What had started as weekend practice sessions at her uncle's ranch had evolved into something approaching obsession. Every morning before her shift at the county assessor's office, she would drive 20 minutes into the hills above Riverside, where the crack of her pistol would echo off the canyon walls like a prayer being answered. Her uncle, David Chen, had been the one to first notice her natural ability. A retired Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, David understood the difference between someone who could shoot and someone who could truly aim. "It's not about the gun," he had told her during one of their early sessions, his weathered hands guiding her stance. "It's about finding that still point inside yourself, that place where doubt can't follow." Now, as Maya felt the weight of a dozen skeptical gazes, she searched for that still point her uncle had described. The betting continued around her, voices rising and falling like a tide of testosterone and misplaced confidence. Morrison's laugh boomed across the range, a sound that seemed designed to rattle nerves and shake confidence. "First time shooting with an audience, sweetheart?" Morrison asked, his tone dripping with false concern. "It's different when people are watching. Changes everything." Maya's response was to turn toward the target line, her movements fluid and purposeful. The standard law enforcement target stood 50 yards away, a human silhouette with concentric circles marking the scoring zones. Bullseye shots would need to hit the innermost ring, a circle roughly the size of a coffee mug, viewed from the length of a football field. Under normal circumstances, it was a challenging but achievable goal for an experienced shooter. Under the current circumstances, with $10,000 riding on the outcome and a dozen skeptical professionals watching her every move, it bordered on the impossible. But Maya had never been particularly concerned with other people's definitions of impossible. She had grown up in a household where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse while studying for her citizenship exam, where dinner conversations were conducted in a mixture of Mandarin and English, and where the American dream was pursued with the methodical determination of someone who understood that second chances were rare and precious. Excellence wasn't an option in the Chen household, it was an expectation. As fundamental as breathing. The first shot would come in 3 minutes. Morrison had insisted on ceremony, on building the tension until it became almost unbearable. He consulted his tactical watch with the gravity of a man preparing to witness history, though he remained convinced that history would vindicate his assumptions about natural ability and proper training. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the theatrical weight of a carnival barker, "we are about to witness either the most impressive display of beginner's luck in the history of this facility, or a very expensive lesson in why we don't bet against experience." Maya's breathing had already begun to slow, her heart rate dropping into the zone where precision lived. She had learned to trust her body's responses, to surrender to the mechanics of marksmanship that her grandfather had passed down through generations of steady hands and clear eyes. The Colt felt like an extension of her arm, its weight distributed perfectly through muscles that had been trained to find their mark, despite distraction or doubt. Deputy Rodriguez stepped forward with a clipboard, his role as official scorer lending gravity to the proceedings. "Standard scoring," he announced. 10 shots, 50 yards, best of luck to both sides." He paused, glancing between Maya and the assembled betting pool. "Though I gotta say, 10 grand is a hell of a lot of faith to put in someone we've never seen shoot." The morning sun had burned through the mist now, casting sharp shadows across the range and illuminating every detail with crystalline clarity. Maya could see the target with perfect definition. The black rings nested within each other like ripples in a pond, the bullseye waiting at the center like a challenge that had been issued across generations of shooters who had stood in this exact spot, faced this exact test. Morrison raised his hand, ready to signal the beginning of the contest. "Remember, Chen, 10 shots, and they all need to count. Miss the bullseye even once, and my boys here get to pay for a very expensive weekend in Vegas." Maya's response was to close her eyes for just a moment, feeling for that still point her uncle had taught her to find. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could hear her grandfather's voice, speaking in the broken English he had never quite mastered, but which had carried more wisdom than any textbook. "Steady hand, clear mind, honest heart. Everything else is just noise." When she opened her eyes, the noise had faded to a whisper. The betting, the boasting, the barely concealed condescension, all of it receded until there was nothing left but the mathematical relationship between her position, the weapon in her hands, and the target that waited 50 yards away. Morrison's hand dropped, and Maya Chun began to show them exactly what $10,000 worth of underestimation looked like. But first, the gun had to clear leather, the stance had to be perfect, and the breathing had to find its rhythm. And in the space between Morrison's signal and Maya's first shot, a dozen assumptions about ability, training, and natural talent hung in the desert, air like a question that was about to receive a very definitive answer. Maya's life had been measured in small victories and smaller expectations for as long as she could remember. At 5:30 every morning, her alarm would pierce the darkness of her studio apartment in Riverside, the sound competing with the distant hum of the Interstate 215 that carried the early commuters toward their own daily battles. She would rise in the gray pride-on light, her feet finding the cold hardwood floor with the same precision that would later guide her. Hand to the pistol grip, the ritual never varied. Coffee first, black, no sugar, brewed strong enough to wake the dead, then 20 minutes of stretching exercises her uncle had taught her, movements designed to loosen the muscles that would matter when steadiness became the difference between success and failure. The apartment was sparse, functional, decorated with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to invest too heavily in things that could be taken away. Her day job at the Riverside County Assessor's office paid the bills and provided health insurance, but it was the kind of work that slowly ground down the soul through sheer repetition. Property valuations, tax assessments, endless paperwork that determined how much people owed to a system that rarely seemed to give back in equal measure. Maya had been there for 3 years, ever since graduating from UC Riverside with a degree in public administration and dreams that had seemed much larger when viewed from the distance of a college campus. Her supervisor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, was a 63-year-old career bureaucrat who had perfected the art of being helpful and obstructive in equal measure. "Maya, dear," she would say in her sweetly condescending tone, "perhaps you should focus on the work in front of you instead of whatever it is you do on weekends." The comment always came with a meaningful glance at Maya's hands, which bore the telltale calluses of someone who spent considerable time gripping things that most office workers never touched. But Maya had learned to compartmentalize, to let her coworkers see only the version of herself that fit their expectations. Quiet, reliable, forgettable. During lunch breaks, she would eat homemade sandwiches while reading tactical manuals checked out from the library, the pages hidden inside, copies of administrative procedures that no one would ever think to examine too closely. Her evenings belonged to preparation, though she had never been quite sure what she was preparing for until Deputy Webb had approached her with his unofficial invitation. The garage behind her apartment complex had been converted into a makeshift training space, complete with dry fire practice stations and a small workshop where she maintained her grandfather's Colt with the devotion of a monk tending to sacred relics. The gun had come to her on her 21st birthday, along with a letter written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. Shen Wei Ming had died when Maya was 15, but his words had waited patiently for her to become old enough to understand their weight. "My dear granddaughter, this weapon saved my life 17 times during the war, and it has waited 17 years for someone worthy to carry it again. Your hands are steady, your heart is strong, and your mind is clear. These are gifts, but they are also responsibilities. Use them wisely, and remember that the greatest victory is the fight you never have to finish. Maya kept the letter folded in her wallet, the paper soft with handling and the ink faded but still legible. During the long hours of practice, when doubt crept in like fog rolling off the Pacific, she would read those words and remember that she was part of something larger than her own ambitions. Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in 1985 with nothing but a medical degree that wasn't recognized in the United States and a determination that could have powered a small city. She had worked as a hospital orderly while studying for her medical boards, raising Maya as a single mother and somehow finding time to pursue her dream of becoming a family physician. The small clinic she now ran in East Riverside served the immigrant community with the kind of care that came from understanding what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. "You have your grandfather's eyes," Dr. Chen would tell Maya during their weekly dinners, served in the cramped kitchen above the clinic, "and his stubbornness. Sometimes I worry that you've inherited too much of both." The concern was always delivered with love, but it carried an undercurrent of fear, the knowledge that stubbornness could be either a gift or a curse, depending on how the world chose to respond to it. Maya's social life existed in the margins, built around the shooting community that gathered at informal ranges throughout the Inland Empire. There was Tommy Nguyen, a Vietnam veteran who ran a gun shop in Riverside and served as an unofficial mentor to anyone who showed genuine dedication to the craft. Maria Santos, a competitive shooter who worked as a paramedic and understood what it meant to perform under pressure. Jake Morrison, no relation to Sergeant Morrison, despite the shared surname, a former Army sniper who had returned from Iraq with skills that didn't translate easily to civilian life. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared obsession, friendships forged in cordite and maintained through countless hours of practice. They had watched Maya develop from an enthusiastic beginner into something approaching mastery, though none of them had quite understood the depth of her commitment till she began talking about applying for law enforcement positions. "You sure about this path?" Tommy had asked her one evening as they cleaned their weapons after a particularly challenging practice session. "It's not going to be easy for someone like you. Lot of people in that world who aren't ready to accept change." Maya's response had been to load another magazine and return to the firing line, her silence carrying more conviction than any verbal argument could have provided. She had learned that the best way to answer doubt was with demonstration, to let results speak louder than explanations. The rejection letters had started arriving in March. The LAPD, the California Highway Patrol, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, all expressing appreciation for her interest and regret that they couldn't offer her a position at this time. The language was always professional, always polite, and always maddeningly vague about the specific reasons for rejection. Deputy Webb had been different. He had approached her after watching her shoot at an informal competition in Beaumont, his weathered face serious as he studied her target with the eye of someone who understood the difference between luck and skill. "You ever think about law enforcement?" he had asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Every day," Maya had replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the response. "Well, maybe it's time law enforcement started thinking about you." That conversation had led to months of preparation, of training that went mere marksmanship to encompass the mental discipline required to perform under scrutiny. Webb had provided guidance when he could, unofficial coaching that had to be carefully concealed from his superiors who might not have approved of his extracurricular mentoring activities. The morning of the bet, Maya had arrived at the range 2 hours early, using the solitude to center herself and visualize the shots. That would soon determine whether her dreams had any basis in reality. She had walked the 50 yards to the target line, studying the background, noting the wind patterns, calculating the minor adjustments that would be necessary to account for the morning light, and the slight elevation change. Her breakfast had been simple, oatmeal with berries, black coffee, a banana for the potassium that would help prevent muscle tremors. She had learned to treat her body like a precision instrument, to provide it with exactly what it needed for optimal performance, while avoiding anything that might introduce variables into the equation. The drive to the training academy had been conducted in silence, her grandfather's Colt secured in its case alongside 50 rounds of match-grade ammunition that she had loaded herself the previous evening. Each cartridge had been inspected, weighed, and measured to ensure consistency, because Maya understood that, when everything was on the line, even the smallest details could make the difference between success and failure. Now, as Sergeant Morrison's hand dropped and the contest officially began, Maya felt the familiar transformation that came with absolute focus. The sounds of the betting pool faded to a whisper, the morning heat became irrelevant, and her entire universe contracted to encompass nothing beyond the mathematical relationship between her position, her weapon, and the target that waited 50 yards away. Her first shot would establish the tone for everything that followed. It would either confirm the assumptions of 12 experienced law enforcement officers, or it would announce that something new had arrived at the Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy. Something that didn't fit their expectations, their experience, or their $10,000 bet. Maya's breathing slowed, her heartbeat dropped into the zone where precision lived, and her finger began its careful journey toward the trigger that would answer all their questions about her worthiness, her preparation, and her right to stand on the same range where they had spent years proving their own capabilities. The Colt felt like an extension of her will, its weight perfectly balanced through hands that had been trained to find their mark despite doubt, distraction, or the weight of $10,000 worth of skepticism. The first shot cracked across the range like a statement of intent, the sound echoing off the concrete barriers and rolling across the desert floor with the authority of absolute precision. Maya felt the familiar recoil travel through her arms and shoulders, her body automatically adjusting to maintain perfect sight, alignment as the spent brass case arced through the morning air and landed with a soft ping on the concrete at her feet. 50 yards away, the target remained motionless for a heartbeat, then two. Deputy Rodriguez raised his binoculars, his weathered face creasing into a frown of concentration as he studied the black circle at the center of the target. The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on the interstate and the soft whistle of wind through the chain-link fence that surrounded the facility. "Bullseye," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he couldn't quite suppress. "Dead center." The betting pool exchanged glances, their earlier confidence beginning to show hairline cracks. Sergeant Morrison's smile remained fixed in place, but something in his eyes had shifted, the look of a poker player who had just seen an unexpected card hit the table. "Lucky shot," Morrison declared, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Let's see her do it again." Maya's second shot followed 18 seconds later, the interval carefully calculated to allow her breathing to settle and her grip to find its optimal position. The Colt spoke again, its voice unchanged by the pressure or the scrutiny, and another brass case joined the first on the concrete beneath her feet. "Bullseye," Rodriguez called out, though this time his announcement was met with a longer silence from the assembled crowd. Deputy Martinez felt something twist in her stomach, not fear exactly, but the recognition that she was witnessing something that would change the dynamics of everything that followed. She had seen enough competitive shooting to understand the difference between accident and precision, and what she was watching bore all the hallmarks of carefully cultivated skill being unleashed under pressure. "2 for 2, Martinez murmured, loud enough for the others to hear. "That's not luck anymore." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the group. "It's a long way from 10 shots, boys. Plenty of room for things to go sideways." But as Maya settled into her rhythm, Finding the meditative state that her uncle had taught her to cultivate, it became increasingly clear that sideways was not a direction she intended to explore. Her third shot struck the bullseye with the same unforgiving precision as the first two, followed by a fourth that seemed to occupy the exact same hole in the target. The betting pool was no longer exchanging confident glances. Deputy Kevin Bulldog Harrison, a 20-year veteran who had earned his nickname through a combination of persistence and an unfortunate resemblance to an English bulldog, shifted uncomfortably as he calculated what a perfect score might cost him. "Maybe we should have asked to see her credentials before we started throwing money around," he muttered to Deputy Angela Torres, who nodded grimly in response. "Little late for that kind of thinking," Torres replied, her eyes never leaving Maya's steady form at the firing line. Torres had spent 15 years working her way up through the ranks, and she possessed the kind of practical intelligence that came from learning to read situations quickly and accurately. What she was reading now suggested that the morning was about to become very expensive for a lot of people who should have known better. Maya's fifth shot punched through the target with mechanical precision, and Rodriguez's confirmation of another bullseye was met with the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral parlors and tax audits. The mathematics were becoming unavoidable. 5 shots, 5 perfect scores, and 5 more opportunities for the betting pool to watch their weekend plans evaporate in the desert heat. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward, his boots crunching on the scattered brass cases as he moved to within conversational distance of Maya's position. "Hell of a performance so far," he said, his tone struggling to maintain its earlier casualness. "But you know how it is, sometimes the pressure gets to people. Sometimes that steady hand starts to shake right when you need it most." Maya's response was to reload with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed, her fingers finding fresh cartridges without conscious thought while her eyes remained fixed on the target. She had entered what competitive shooters called the zone, that state of heightened awareness where external distractions cease to exist, and the entire world contracted to encompass only the essential elements of the task at hand. Her sixth shot followed the same trajectory as the previous 5, the bullet traveling the 50 yards to the target, in a perfectly straight line that seemed to mock the laws of physics and probability. The impact was visible even from the firing line, a tiny puff of paper dust as the projectile punched through the bullseye with surgical precision. "Jesus Christ," Deputy Harrison breathed, loud enough for the others to hear. "She's not missing. She's not even close to missing." Morrison's face had begun to show the strain of maintaining his composure, sweat beading on his forehead despite the relatively cool morning temperature. 28 years in law enforcement had taught him to read situations with accuracy, and the situation he was reading now suggested that his reputation for infallibility was about to encounter a very expensive exception. "Still got 4 shots left," he announced to the group, though his voice had lost its earlier theatrical quality. "Long way from home plate." But Maya was already settling into position for her 7th shot, her breathing controlled and her heartbeat steady as a metronome. The Colt had become an extension of her will, its familiar weight distributed through muscles that had been trained to perform this exact sequence of movements thousands of times until conscious thought became unnecessary. The 7th shot struck the bullseye with the same uncompromising accuracy as its predecessors, and Deputy Rodriguez's confirmation seemed to hang in the air like an indictment of everyone who had been foolish enough to bet against precision and preparation. Deputy Martinez found herself studying Maya with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become personally relevant. There was something in the younger woman's posture that spoke of absolute confidence, not the brash swagger that often passed for self-assurance in law enforcement circles, but the quiet certainty that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of accomplishing. "Where the hell did Webb find her?" Martinez murmured to Deputy Frank "Tank" Williams, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the sheriff's department. Williams who possessed the kind of tactical experience that allowed him to recognize genuine skill when he encountered it, shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter where he found her," he replied. "What matters is that we just bet against someone who shoots like she was born with that gun in her hand." Maya's 8th shot continued the pattern of mathematical perfection, the bullet following a trajectory that seemed to have been calculated by a computer and executed by a machine. The sound of the impact was barely audible from 50 yards away, but the confirmation from Rodriguez carried across the range with the weight of approaching inevitability. 8 for 8, Rodriguez announced, though by now his words were merely documenting what everyone could see with their own eyes. Sergeant Morrison's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the grim expression of a man watching his assumptions crumble in real time. He had built his reputation on the ability to assess talent accurately, to separate genuine skill from lucky accidents and inflated egos. The young woman standing at the firing line represented a catastrophic failure of that assessment, and the financial implications were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. 2 more shots, Morrison said, though he was clearly speaking more to himself than to anyone else. Still got 2 more chances for things to go wrong. But Maya's 9th shot provided no comfort for anyone who had bet against her, punching through the bullseye with the same relentless precision that had characterized every previous shot. The target had been systematically destroyed, the bullseye, reduced to a ragged hole that spoke of accuracy so consistent it bordered on the supernatural. The betting pool had fallen completely silent now, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by the hollow expressions of people watching their money disappear one perfectly placed bullet at a time. Deputy Harrison loosened his collar despite the morning chill, calculating mortgage payments and car loans against the increasingly certain prospect of having to cover a bet that had seemed like easy money 30 minutes earlier. Maya took her time preparing for the final shot. Not because she needed the extra seconds to compose herself, but because she wanted to savor the moment when everything she had worked for would be distilled into a single squeeze of the trigger. The Colt felt like an old friend in her hands, its familiar weight providing comfort and confidence as she lined up the sights for the 10th and final time. The morning sun had climbed higher, now casting sharp shadows across the range and illuminating every detail with crystalline clarity. Maya could see the target with perfect definition, the bullseye waiting at the center like a challenge that had been issued across generations of shooters who had stood in this exact spot and faced this exact test. Her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat, her finger finding the trigger with the patience of someone who understood that rushing was the enemy of precision. The world contracted around her until nothing existed beyond the relationship between her position, her weapon, and the mathematical certainty of the shot that would complete her. Demonstration dot when Maya's 10th shot cracked across the range. It carried with it the weight of months of preparation, years of training, and a lifetime of being underestimated by people who confused their assumptions with reality. The bullet traveled its 50-yard journey in less than 1/10 of a second, but the implications of its impact would resonate far longer than the sound of the gunshot itself. "Bullseye," Rodriguez announced for the 10th time, though his voice now carried a note of awe that had been entirely absent from his earlier confirmations. 10 for 10. Perfect score. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sergeant Morrison removing his wallet from his back pocket, his movements slow and deliberate as he calculated the cost of his certainty. Around him, 11 other law enforcement officers performed similar calculations, their faces reflecting the mathematical reality of having bet against someone who had just demonstrated that some kinds of excellence couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Maya cleared her weapon with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the contest, her movements unhurried as she secured the Colt in its holster and turned to face the group of men and women who had just learned an expensive lesson about the dangers of assumption. The morning was far from over, and the implications of what had just transpired would ripple through the Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy for months to come. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of mathematical perfection, there was nothing left to do but count the cost of underestimating Maya Chen. The silence stretched across the range like a physical presence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the soft whistle of wind through the chain-link fence. Sergeant Morrison stood frozen with his wallet in his hand, the leather worn smooth from 30 years of carrying it through countless shifts, arrests, and encounters with the unexpected. The morning sun caught the badge on his chest, casting angular shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of his miscalculation. Deputy Rodriguez lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of professional admiration and personal disbelief. In 22 years of law enforcement, he had witnessed remarkable displays of marksmanship, but nothing that approached the clinical precision he had just documented. The target 50 yards away looked as though it had been attacked by a paper punch, the bullseye obliterated by 10 perfectly placed shots that had struck with the consistency of a machine. "Well, I'll be damned," Rodriguez murmured, his voice carrying across the range with the weight of genuine respect. "In all my years, I've never seen anything quite like that." Maya holstered her grandfather's Colt with movements that had become as natural as breathing, her fingers automatically performing the safety checks that had been drilled into her through countless hours of practice. The familiar weight of the weapon settled against her hip, a comforting presence that had anchored her through the most intense 30 minutes of her professional life. Deputy Martinez stepped forward first, her boots crunching on the scattered brass cases as she extended her hand toward Maya. "Hell of a performance," she said, her voice carrying the kind of respect that could only be earned through demonstrated competence under pressure. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My grandfather," Maya replied simply, accepting the handshake with a grip that spoke of steady hands and unshakable confidence. "He taught me that precision isn't about luck or natural talent. It's about preparation meeting opportunity." Sergeant Morrison finally found his voice, though it carried none of the earlier bluster that had characterized his pre-contest commentary. "Your grandfather must have been one hell of a teacher," he admitted, his tone grudging but genuine. "That was shooting at a level most people never reach, regardless of how long they practice." The financial reckoning began with the methodical precision of an audit. Deputy Harrison reached for his wallet with the resigned expression of a man who had learned an expensive lesson about the dangers of assumption. "10 grand, he said, his voice flat as he counted out bills that represented a significant portion of his discretionary income. "Should have asked to see some credentials before we started throwing money around." Maya accepted the growing pile of currency with quiet dignity, making no effort to gloat or emphasize the magnitude of her victory. The money represented vindication, but it also carried the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that her performance had elevated expectations that would now follow her through whatever came next. Deputy Torres approached with her contribution, shaking her head as she added her bills to the collection. 23 years on the force," she said, "and I just got schooled by someone who probably wasn't even born when I started carrying a badge. Pride goeth before the fall and all that." "It's not about experience," Maya replied, her voice carrying the patience of someone who understood that competence often came disguised in unexpected packages. "It's about respecting the fundamentals and never assuming that good enough is actually good enough." Deputy Webb had remained silent throughout the contest, his weathered face reflecting satisfaction that went beyond mere vindication. He had recognized something special in Maya's shooting months earlier, but even he hadn't anticipated the level of precision she would demonstrate under pressure. As he watched his colleagues come to terms with their miscalculation, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a mentor whose faith had been justified by results. "How long have you been shooting?" Deputy Williams asked, his military background giving him a deeper appreciation for the level of skill he had just witnessed. Former Marines understood the difference between competence and excellence, and what he had observed fell firmly into the latter category. Seriously? About 6 years, Maya replied, accepting another contribution to the growing pile of money. But my grandfather started teaching me when I was 12. He said that marksmanship was like any other discipline. You could fake it for a while, but eventually the truth always comes out. Sergeant Morrison had finished counting his contribution, the bills representing not just a financial loss, but a recalibration of assumptions that had guided his career for 3 decades. 6 years, he repeated, his voice reflecting something between admiration and incredulity. Most people don't reach that level of consistency in 20. Most people don't have the right teacher, Maya replied, her tone carrying reverence for the grandfather who had passed down more than just marksmanship techniques. He used to say that shooting was 10% mechanics and 90% mind. Get your head right, and your hands will follow. Deputy Martinez studied Maya with the intensity of someone trying to understand how she had so completely misjudged the situation. Webb mentioned you'd been applying for law enforcement positions, she said. Getting many callbacks? Maya's expression darkened almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing her features like a cloud passing over the sun. Not many, she admitted. Most departments seem to think I lack the right kind of experience. The assembled group exchanged glances, their earlier assumptions about Maya's qualifications undergoing rapid revision. Deputy Harrison, still stinging from his financial loss, shook his head in disgust. Bunch of idiots, he muttered. Anyone who can shoot like that has something most recruits never develop. It's not just about the shooting, Maya replied, though her voice carried an edge that hadn't been present during the contest. There are other factors that departments consider when evaluating candidates. The implication hung in the desert. Air like smoke from a gunshot, unspoken but unmistakable. Deputy Torres, who had fought her own battles against institutional assumptions during her rise through the ranks, recognized the frustration that underlay Maya's diplomatic response. Other factors, Torres repeated, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Right, let me guess. They're concerned about your ability to handle high-stress situations. Maya's smile was thin but genuine. Something like that. Sergeant. Morrison had been quiet during this exchange, his mind working through the implications of what he had witnessed. A shooter of Maya's caliber should have been recruited aggressively by every department in Southern California, yet here she stood, collecting winnings from a bet that never should have been necessary in the first place. You got copies of those rejection letters? Morrison asked, his tone shifting from casual curiosity to professional interest. The question carried weight beyond its simple words, the suggestion that institutional failures might require institutional remedies. Maya nodded slowly, recognizing the change in Morrison's demeanor. A few dozen of them. All very polite, all very vague about the specific reasons for rejection. Deputy Rodriguez, who had been documenting the contest with official precision, set down his clipboard and studied Maya with new understanding. You mind if I ask what kind of scores you've been posting on the written exams? Physical fitness assessments? Top 5% on every written exam I've taken, Maya replied without hesitation. Physical fitness scores in the 95th percentile or better. Psychological evaluations all came back clean. She paused, her dark eyes reflecting something between frustration and resignation. Apparently, excellent performance across all measurable criteria doesn't guarantee consideration. The implications of her statement settled over the group like a weight that couldn't be ignored. These were experienced law enforcement officers who understood how recruitment worked, who knew the difference between legitimate concerns and institutional resistance to change. What Maya was describing bore all the hallmarks of systematic exclusion disguised as bureaucratic process. Deputy Martinez felt her jaw tighten as the full scope of the situation became clear. How many departments? She asked, though she suspected. She already knew the answer. 17 so far, Maya replied, her voice steady despite the obvious frustration that underlay her words. LAPD, CHP, San Bernardino County, Orange County, Ventura County, pretty much every major department within driving distance. Sergeant Morrison's expression had shifted from embarrassment about his lost bet to something approaching anger at a system that would overlook talent of Maya's caliber. In his 3 decades of law enforcement, he had seen departments struggle to find recruits who possessed even basic competency with firearms. The idea that someone with Maya's demonstrated abilities was being systematically excluded struck him as both wasteful and fundamentally unjust. "That's not right," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his opinions through decades of practical experience. "I don't care what other factors they're considering. Talent like this doesn't come along often. And when it does, smart departments find ways to bring it into the fold." Deputy Williams, whose military background had given him experience with institutional bureaucracy, shook his head in disgust. "It's the same old story," he said. "Change is hard, and some people would rather stick with what they know than adapt to new realities." Maya appreciated the support, but she had learned not to invest too heavily in expressions of sympathy that rarely translated into meaningful action. "I appreciate the sentiment," she said diplomatically, "but good intentions don't change hiring decisions." Webb finally stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting the satisfaction of a plan that was beginning to bear fruit. "Maybe not," he said, "but demonstrated competence under pressure has a way of changing minds." He gestured toward the target. 50 yards away, now little more than a collection of holes held together by the hope of remaining paper. "What happened here this morning isn't going to stay quiet. Word gets around, especially when it involves $10,000 and a perfect score." The truth of Webb's statement was already beginning to manifest itself. Deputy Torres had her phone out, photographing the target from multiple angles while Rodriguez documented the contest results with official precision. In the age of social media and departmental gossip networks, news of Maya's performance would spread through law enforcement circles with the speed of wildfire. "You think this changes anything?" Maya asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced that a single demonstration, however impressive, would be sufficient to overcome months of systematic rejection. Morrison was already reaching for his own phone, his fingers moving with purpose as he scrolled through his contacts. "It changes everything," he said with conviction. "I've got friends in recruitment at half a dozen departments, and every one of them is going to hear about what happened here before the sun goes down." Maya felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, because hope had proven too fragile to survive repeated disappointment, but something more substantial, recognition perhaps. The acknowledgement that competence, when demonstrated with sufficient clarity, possessed its own form of political power. Deputy Martinez pocketed her contribution to Maya's winnings and extended her business card. "I want you to have my direct number," she said. "When the callbacks start coming, and they will start coming, you're going to need someone who understands how these departments really work." The gesture was practical rather than sentimental, but it carried weight beyond its simple functionality. Maya was no longer an outsider looking in. She had become someone worth cultivating, someone whose demonstrated abilities commanded respect from professionals who understood the difference between competence and excellence. As the group began to disperse, their earlier assumptions replaced by grudging respect and genuine curiosity about Maya's potential, Webb approached with the satisfied expression of a chess player who had just executed a strategy months in the making. "This was never really about the money," he said quietly, his voice pitched for Maya's ears alone. "It was about creating a situation where they couldn't ignore what you're capable of." Maya studied the older deputy's weathered face, recognizing the intelligence that had guided their interaction from the beginning. "You orchestrated this entire thing," she said. Though her tone carried admiration rather than accusation, Webb's smile was subtle but genuine. I created an opportunity, he corrected. You're the one who took advantage of it. And now everyone who matters knows exactly what the departments that rejected you decided to pass up. The morning sun had climbed higher now, burning off the last of the desert mist and casting sharp shadows across the range where Maya had just rewritten the assumptions of 12 experienced law enforcement officers. The scattered brass cases at her feet caught the light like golden seeds, physical evidence of a performance that would reshape how people thought about her capabilities. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket, the first of what would become a steady stream of calls and messages as word of her demonstration spread through professional networks. The sound represented the beginning of a new chapter, one where her abilities would precede her reputation rather than being dismissed by it. Sergeant Morrison finished his phone call and turned back toward Maya, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just set important wheels in motion. Just got off the phone with Captain Roberts at San Bernardino County, he said. Funny thing, seems they've got a sudden opening in their recruitment program. Apparently, they'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your application. Maya felt her pulse quicken despite her efforts to maintain composure. San Bernardino County had been one of the first departments to reject her application, their form letter citing concerns about her readiness for the challenges of law enforcement. The irony of their sudden interest wasn't lost on her, but she had learned to focus on opportunities rather than grievances. When? She asked, her voice steady despite the electricity that seemed to crackle through her nervous system. Tomorrow morning, if you're available, Morrison replied. Captain Roberts mentioned that he was very interested in discussing your qualifications in person. Around them, the Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy continued its normal operations, but something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between Maya Chen and the law enforcement community that had spent months overlooking her potential. The target 50 yards away bore testament to a level of skill that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and the financial cost of underestimating her had provided a lesson that would resonate far beyond the confines of the shooting range. Maya's phone buzzed again, then again, each vibration representing another opportunity that had materialized in the wake of her demonstration. The money in her pocket was significant, but the respect she had earned was invaluable, the recognition that she possessed capabilities that departments needed, whether they had been willing to admit it or not. The news of Maya's perfect score spread through Southern California law enforcement circles with the velocity of a bullet traveling 50 yards to its target. By noon on the day of the contest, 3 department recruitment officers had called her directly, their voices carrying the kind of enthusiasm that had been conspicuously absent from previous interactions. By evening, that number had grown to 7, and Maya found herself in the unusual position of having to schedule interviews rather than beg for consideration. Captain Sarah Roberts of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was the first to meet with Maya in person, her office walls decorated with commendations that spoke of a career built on recognizing talent and developing it properly. At 45, Roberts had risen through the ranks by combining operational excellence with administrative acumen, and she possessed the kind of practical intelligence that allowed her to separate institutional momentum from institutional wisdom. "I'll be direct with you, Miss Chen," Roberts said as Maya settled into the chair across from her desk. "We made a mistake when we rejected your initial application. Several mistakes, actually. I'd like the opportunity to correct them." Maya had prepared for this conversation during the sleepless hours following her demonstration at Riverside, rehearsing responses that balanced professional diplomacy with justifiable frustration. But Roberts's straightforward acknowledgement of error caught her slightly off guard, creating space for honesty that hadn't existed in previous interactions. "I appreciate the candor," Maya replied carefully, "though I have to wonder what changed between my rejection letter and your phone call yesterday." Roberts smiled with the expression of someone who had expected exactly that question. What changed is that we received a very detailed report about your performance under pressure, along with photographic evidence that our initial assessment process might have overlooked someone with exceptional capabilities." She paused, studying Maya with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become personally important. Sergeant Morrison can be very persuasive when he believes in something. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory that Maya's previous interviews had never approached. Roberts was interested in her grandfather's military service, her mother's immigration story, and the combination of cultural influences that had shaped her approach to discipline and preparation. More importantly, she seemed genuinely curious about Maya's long-term goals and how the department might help her achieve them. "We're not just looking for someone who can shoot," Roberts explained as their meeting drew toward a close. "We're looking for someone who understands that precision under pressure is a transferable skill. Your performance at Riverside suggests that you've mastered something that can't be taught, the ability to perform when everything is on the line." Maya left the meeting with a provisional offer pending completion of the standard background check and medical evaluation. But more importantly, she left with the recognition that her demonstration had fundamentally altered how people thought about her potential. The rejection letters that had accumulated over months of fruitless applications now seemed like artifacts from a different era, reminders of institutional short-sightedness rather than personal inadequacy. Deputy Webb met her for coffee that afternoon at Murphy's Diner, the same location where he had first suggested that she might be ready to show law enforcement what she could do. His weathered face reflected satisfaction that went beyond mere vindication, the quiet contentment of someone who had successfully navigated a complex challenge through patience and strategic thinking. 7 departments, Webb said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to savor small victories. "And that's just the first day. Word is still spreading." Maya nodded, though her expression carried thoughtfulness rather than celebration. "It's gratifying," she admitted, "but it also raises questions about how these decisions were made in the first place. If my qualifications were sufficient today, why weren't they sufficient 6 months ago?" Webb's smile was grim but understanding. "Because 6 months ago, you were just another applicant with impressive test scores and no track record. Now you're the person who took $10,000 off some of the best shots in Riverside County. Perception is reality in this business, and your perception just changed completely." The truth of his statement was reinforced over the following weeks as Maya navigated a recruitment process that bore little resemblance to her previous experiences. Department representatives who had once seemed disinterested now competed for her attention, offering training opportunities, assignment preferences, and career development paths that reflected genuine investment in her long-term success. Maya's mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, observed these developments with the mixture of pride and concern that had characterized her approach to parenting since Maya was old enough to demonstrate her own strong will. During one of their weekly dinners, served in the cramped kitchen above the clinic, she voiced the questions that Maya had been asking herself. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the price of pursuing difficult dreams. Success can create its own form of pressure, especially when it comes at the cost of making others look foolish. Maya had been considering the same question since her demonstration at Riverside, weighing the satisfaction of vindication against the responsibility that came with elevated expectations. "I think it's what grandfather would have wanted," she replied, her voice carrying conviction that had been tested by months of rejection and uncertainty. "He used to say that talents were gifts that came with obligations. If I have the ability to serve, then I have the responsibility to serve well." The formal offer from San Bernardino County arrived 3 weeks after Maya's perfect score, accompanied by a training schedule that would begin the following month and a starting salary that reflected recognition of her exceptional capabilities. But Maya had learned to think strategically about career decisions, and she spent considerable time evaluating not just the immediate opportunity, but the long-term implications of joining an organization that had initially rejected her. Captain Roberts addressed those concerns during their final meeting before Maya's acceptance deadline, her office now familiar territory rather than foreign ground. "I won't pretend that everyone in this department is thrilled about our decision to reverse course," Roberts said with characteristic directness. "Change is difficult, and some people interpret it as criticism of previous decisions. But leadership means making choices based on current information rather than past assumptions." Maya appreciated the honesty, even as it reinforced her understanding that acceptance would come with challenges that went beyond the standard difficulties of police training. "What kind of resistance should I expect?" she asked, her tone reflecting pragmatic curiosity rather than apprehension. "The usual suspects," Roberts replied. "People who confuse tradition with wisdom, who think that departing from established patterns somehow diminishes their own achievements." She paused, studying Maya with the intensity of someone delivering important information. "But you've already proven that you can perform under pressure, and that's the only currency that really matters in this profession." Maya accepted the position. The following day, her decision accompanied by a sense of completion that had been missing during months of uncertainty and rejection. The path forward would undoubtedly present challenges, but they would be the challenges of someone who had earned her place through demonstrated competence rather than the challenges of someone fighting for recognition of her potential. Her first day at the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Academy began at 06:00 hours on a Monday morning in October, the Southern California air carrying the crisp promise of seasonal change. Maya arrived 30 minutes early, her grandfather's Colt secured in her gear bag, alongside equipment that bore the careful attention to detail that had characterized her preparation for the Riverside demonstration. The academy class consisted of 24 recruits, their backgrounds representing the full spectrum of American experience: former military personnel, college graduates, career changers, and individuals who had dreamed of law enforcement since childhood. Maya took her place among them with quiet confidence, her performance at Riverside having preceded her arrival and established expectations that she was prepared to meet. The training that followed was comprehensive and demanding, covering everything from legal procedures to defensive tactics to the psychological challenges of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Maya excelled across all disciplines, but it was during firearms training that her exceptional abilities became most apparent to both instructors and fellow recruits. Sergeant David "Hawk" Martinez, the Academy's chief firearms instructor and a veteran of 22 years in law enforcement, had been briefed about Maya's reputation before her arrival. But even with advanced warning, he found himself impressed by the consistency and precision of her performance under increasingly challenging conditions. "Chen," Martinez called out during a stress-fire exercise designed to test accuracy under simulated combat conditions. Front and center. Maya approached the instructor's position with steady composure, her breathing controlled despite the elevated heart rate that came with high-intensity training. Around her, fellow recruits struggled with scenarios designed to challenge their ability to maintain precision while experiencing the physiological effects of adrenaline and time pressure. "I've heard stories about you shooting," Martinez said, his tone carrying professional curiosity rather than skepticism. "But stories and performance under training conditions are two different things. You ready to show us what you can do when the stakes are real?" Maya's response was to request permission to demonstrate advanced techniques that went beyond the standard academy curriculum: precision shooting at extended ranges, rapid-fire accuracy drills, and stress scenarios that would have challenged experienced officers. Martinez granted the requests with growing amazement as Maya systematically exceeded every performance benchmark the academy had established. Word of her exceptional abilities spread through the academy and into the broader law enforcement community, creating a reputation that preceded her graduation and influenced assignment decisions that would shape the early years of her career. Departments throughout Southern California began expressing interest in a recruit who had demonstrated capabilities that most officers never developed despite years of experience. Maya graduated from the academy first in her class, her academic and practical performance establishing records that would stand for years to come. The ceremony was attended by family members, fellow recruits, and law enforcement officials who had followed her journey from rejected applicant to exemplary graduate. Captain Roberts delivered the keynote address. Her remarks focused on the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging and the institutional courage required to admit and correct past mistakes. Excellence, she concluded, has a way of announcing itself to those wise enough to pay attention. Our job as leaders is to create environments where that excellence can flourish. Maya's first assignment came with the Special Operations Division, a unit that handled high-risk situations requiring specialized skills and exceptional judgment under pressure. The position represented both opportunity and challenge, the chance to utilize her unique capabilities in service of public safety, balanced against the responsibility of meeting expectations that had been elevated by her reputation. Her new partner, Detective Angela Morrison, Sergeant Morrison's daughter and a 10-year veteran of the department, greeted Maya's arrival with the kind of professional respect that had to be earned rather than assumed. "I heard about your performance at Riverside," Morrison said during their first briefing. "My father still talks about it when he's trying to make points about assumptions and evidence." Maya smiled at the reference, remembering the morning when a $10,000 bet had changed the trajectory of her career. "Your father learned an expensive lesson about the dangers of underestimating people," she replied. "But he also had the grace to admit when he was wrong. That takes character." The partnership that developed between Maya and Detective Morrison proved to be highly effective, combining Maya's exceptional technical skills with Morrison's operational experience and institutional knowledge. Their success rate in resolving complex cases attracted attention from supervisors and earned respect from colleagues who had initially been skeptical about the wisdom of assigning such important responsibilities to a rookie officer. Maya's reputation continued to grow through a series of high-profile cases that showcased her ability to maintain precision under the most challenging circumstances. A hostage situation that was resolved through a single precisely placed shot. A barricaded suspect who surrendered after. Maya demonstrated the futility of resistance by placing warning shots within inches of his position. A multi-agency drug operation that succeeded because Maya's marksmanship skills allowed the team to neutralize threats that would have derailed less precisely executed plans. Each success reinforced the lesson that talent, when properly recognized and developed, could exceed even optimistic expectations. Maya had become living proof that institutional assumptions about capability and potential could be not just wrong, but catastrophically expensive when they prevented organizations from accessing exceptional human resources. 3 months later, the Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy had developed an unexpected tradition since Maya's perfect score demonstration. Every new class of recruits was required to visit the range where she had systematically dismantled a $10,000 bet, studying the target that had been preserved under glass as a reminder that excellence could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Sergeant Morrison, now serving as the Academy's chief instructor, used Maya's story as a teaching tool about the dangers of assumption and the importance of evidence-based decision-making. "This target," Morrison would tell each new group of cadets, his voice carrying the authority of expensive experience, "represents the most costly lesson I've ever learned about the difference between what we think we know and what we actually know." The young woman who created these holes went on to become one of the finest officers in Southern California, But she almost never got the chance because people like me were too busy protecting our assumptions to recognize exceptional talent. Maya's success at San Bernardino County had triggered a comprehensive review of recruitment practices across multiple departments, leading to reforms that emphasized demonstrated competence over traditional background indicators. The Chen Protocol, as it came to be known informally, required departments to provide specific justification for rejecting candidates who exceeded performance benchmarks in measurable categories. Deputy Webb, now promoted to Sergeant Webb, in recognition of his role in identifying and developing Maya's potential, served as a consultant for departments seeking to modernize their recruitment approaches. His expertise in recognizing overlooked talent had become highly valued, and he took considerable satisfaction in helping other exceptional candidates navigate institutional resistance to change. Maya's story isn't unique, Webb would explain during training seminars for recruitment officers. There are probably dozens of candidates like her who get overlooked every year because we're looking for the wrong things or making decisions based on outdated assumptions. The question isn't whether exceptional people exist. It's whether we're smart enough to recognize them when they appear. 1 year later, Maya's reputation had grown beyond the boundaries of law enforcement, making her a sought-after speaker at conferences devoted to organizational development and talent recognition. Her presentation, titled "The Cost of Assumption: How a $10,000 Bet Changed Everything," had become one of the most requested workshops in the professional development circuit, standing before an audience of corporate executives, human resources professionals, and organizational consultants at the San Diego Convention Center. Maya used her experience to illustrate broader principles about the hidden costs of institutional bias and the competitive advantage that came from recognizing excellence in unexpected packages. "The officers who bet against me weren't bad people," she explained to the assembled audience, her voice carrying the measured authority that had made her an effective law enforcement officer. "They were experienced professionals making decisions based on patterns they had observed over decades of service. But patterns can become prisons when they prevent us from recognizing new realities." Her mother, Dr. Lisa Chun, had attended the presentation along with Maya's uncle David and a delegation from the immigrant community that had watched Maya's success with pride and inspiration. The little girl who had learned to shoot tin cans behind her uncle's ranch had become a symbol of possibility for families who understood what it meant to have their capabilities overlooked by institutions that confused familiarity with competence. Maya's partnership with Detective Morrison had evolved into one of the most effective teams in the Special Operations Division, their success rate in resolving complex cases earning recognition from law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The initial skepticism that had greeted Maya's assignment to such a specialized unit had been replaced by grudging respect for results that spoke louder than assumptions. "She's changed how we think about capability," Detective Morrison observed during a department interview about effective partnerships. "Working with Maya has taught me that excellence isn't always packaged the way we expect it to be. Sometimes the most exceptional people are the ones who don't fit our preconceived notions about what exceptional looks like." 2 years later, the Maya Chen Marksmanship Institute had been established at the University of California, Riverside, endowed by donations from law enforcement agencies, private foundations, and individuals who had been inspired by her story of persistence and vindication. The Institute provided scholarships and training opportunities for young people from underrepresented communities, emphasizing not just technical skill development, but the mental discipline required to perform under pressure. Maya served on the Institute's board of directors while maintaining her full-time responsibilities with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, her schedule carefully balanced between operational duties and educational commitments. The facility included state-of-the-art training ranges, classrooms equipped with the latest instructional technology, and a museum that documented the history of marksmanship and its role in law enforcement and competitive shooting. The centerpiece of the museum was the target from Maya's perfect score demonstration, displayed alongside the original bet receipts and testimonials from the officers who had learned expensive lessons about the dangers of underestimation. Visitors could read accounts of how Maya's performance had triggered reforms in recruitment practices and inspired a new generation of shooters who understood that excellence was achievable through dedication and proper instruction. Maya's grandfather's Colt .45 was on permanent display in a temperature-controlled case, accompanied by his Korean War service records and the letter he had written to Maya on her 21st birthday. The exhibit attracted visitors from around the world, many of whom came specifically to understand how a family's immigrant story had intersected with American traditions of marksmanship and service. Tommy Nguyen, now serving as the Institute's chief instructor, had retired from his gun shop to focus full-time on developing the next generation of precision shooters. His classroom walls were decorated with photographs of students who had gone on to successful careers in law enforcement, competitive shooting, and military service, each representing validation of the Institute's mission to develop human potential regardless of its initial packaging. Maya proved that exceptional ability can emerge from anywhere, Nguyen explained to a group of visiting instructors from international law enforcement agencies. Our job isn't to create that ability, it's to recognize it when it appears and provide the resources necessary for it to flourish. 5 years later, Maya had been promoted to detective sergeant, leading a specialized unit that handled the most complex and dangerous cases in San Bernardino County. Her team's success rate had attracted attention from federal agencies, leading to collaborative investigations that showcased the effectiveness of combining traditional law enforcement techniques with precision shooting capabilities that exceeded military standards. The annual Chen Challenge had become a fixture of California law enforcement training, drawing participants from departments throughout the Western United States who competed for recognition as the most accurate shooters in their respective categories. The event raised funds for the Marksmanship Institute, while providing opportunities for professional development and inter-agency cooperation. Maya served as the challenge's chief judge, her presence lending credibility to an event that had grown from informal competition to serious professional development opportunity. She maintained the same methodical approach to accuracy that had characterized her original demonstration, but now her role included mentoring young officers who sought to develop similar capabilities. Precision isn't about perfection, she would tell participants during the pre-competition briefing. It's about consistency under pressure, about maintaining your standards when everything around you is trying to make you compromise them. The target doesn't care about your background, your experience, or other people's assumptions about your potential. It only responds to preparation meeting opportunity. Captain Roberts, now Chief Roberts after her promotion to head the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, had made Maya's recruitment and development a case study taught at the FBI, National Academy, and other advanced law enforcement training programs. The story of how institutional assumptions had nearly prevented the department from accessing exceptional talent had become a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of bias and the competitive advantage that came from evidence-based decision making. Maya's success has saved this department millions of dollars in training costs and operational effectiveness, Roberts explained during a presentation to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. But more importantly, her story has changed how we think about talent recognition and development. We've learned to look beyond surface characteristics to identify the deeper qualities that predict success under pressure. 10 years later, the impact of Maya's original demonstration had rippled through law enforcement culture in ways that continued to surprise even those who had witnessed its immediate effects. Recruitment practices across the country had been modified to emphasize performance-based evaluation over traditional background indicators, leading to significant increases in the diversity and effectiveness of law enforcement agencies. Maya had been appointed as the special agent in charge of a new federal task force focused on precision law enforcement techniques. Her jurisdiction covering the southwestern United States, and her responsibilities including training development for agencies seeking to improve their operational effectiveness. The position represented the culmination of a career that had begun with systematic rejection and evolved into systematic recognition of exceptional capability. Her office at the federal building in Los Angeles was decorated with commendations from agencies throughout the region, but the most prominent display remained her grandfather's letter and a photograph of the target from her perfect score demonstration. The artifacts served as reminders that excellence often emerged from unexpected circumstances, and that the most important victories were often the ones that opened doors for others to follow. The Maya Chen Foundation had grown beyond its original marksmanship focus to encompass broader programs devoted to identifying and developing overlooked talent in underrepresented communities. Scholarship recipients had gone on to successful careers in law enforcement, military service, competitive shooting, and related fields that required precision under pressure. Maya's mother, now in her 70s but still operating her clinic in East Riverside, served on the Foundation's board of directors and provided medical services for training programs that emphasized the connection between physical health and performance under stress. The little clinic that had once struggled to serve the immigrant community had become a model for comprehensive health services that recognized the relationship between individual wellness and community strength. My daughter proved that America's promises are real when people are willing to do the work necessary to claim them, Dr. Chen observed during the Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. But she also proved that those promises require constant vigilance to protect them from people who would rather preserve their assumptions than recognize new realities. Webb, now retired but serving as the Foundation's Director of Law Enforcement Relations, continued to identify exceptional candidates who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional recruitment processes. His network of contacts throughout the region had become an informal early warning system for talent that required advocacy to receive appropriate recognition. Maya's story isn't finished, Webb reflected during an interview with American Police Beat magazine. Every time a department recognizes exceptional ability instead of dismissing it, every time an organization chooses evidence over assumption, every time someone gets an opportunity they've earned instead of being denied one they deserve, that's Maya's story continuing to unfold. 15 years later, the Riverside County Sheriff's Training Academy had been renamed the Maya Chen Law Enforcement Training Center. Its facilities expanded to include advanced simulation technology and international exchange programs that brought officers from around the world to study precision techniques and evidence-based recruitment practices. The center had become a pilgrimage site for law enforcement professionals seeking to understand how organizational cultures could be transformed through recognition of exceptional individual capability. Maya, now Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations Training Division, maintained her residence in Riverside while traveling extensively to implement training programs that emphasize the connection between individual excellence and organizational effectiveness. Her career had become a case study in how personal achievement could drive institutional change when supported by leaders who understood the competitive advantage of evidence-based decision-making. The original betting pool had become something of a legend within law enforcement circles, their expensive lesson serving as a cautionary tale about the cost of assumption and the value of humility in the face of unexpected excellence. Several of the original participants had gone on to become chief executives of their respective departments, their leadership philosophy shaped by the memory of watching $10,000 worth of certainty evaporate one perfectly placed shot at a time. Sergeant Morrison, now retired and serving as a volunteer instructor at the training center that bore Maya's name, used his expensive mistake as a teaching tool for new generations of law enforcement officers. His presentation, titled The $10,000 Target, a personal account of assumption and evidence, had become required viewing for all new recruits and a popular request at law enforcement conferences throughout the country. I learned more about leadership from losing that bet than I had from 30 years of supposedly successful supervision. Morrison would tell audiences, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom that came from acknowledging costly mistakes. Maya didn't just demonstrate exceptional shooting. She demonstrated that our assumptions about capability could be not just wrong, but catastrophically expensive when they prevented us from accessing the talent we needed. Maya's grandfather's Colt .45 had been retired from active service, but remained on display at the training center. Its worn grip and precise balance, serving as tangible reminders that excellence often had deep roots and long histories that connected past achievements to present opportunities. The weapon had become a symbol of intergenerational transmission of values and capabilities, representing the idea that some gifts were meant to be passed forward rather than simply possessed. 20 years later, the ripple effects of Maya's perfect score demonstration had fundamentally altered how American law enforcement agencies approach talent recognition and development. The Chen Protocols had been adopted by departments in all 50 states, leading to measurable improvements in recruitment effectiveness and operational performance that saved taxpayers millions of dollars while enhancing public safety. Maya's story had been documented in multiple books, academic papers, and training films that were used in business schools, leadership development programs, and organizational psychology courses to illustrate the hidden costs of institutional bias and the competitive advantages that came from evidence-based decision-making. Her experience had become a touchstone for discussions about how organizations could adapt to changing demographics while maintaining operational excellence. The Maya Chen International Leadership Institute, established at George Washington University, with funding from law enforcement agencies, private foundations, and international development organizations, provided advanced training for executives who sought to build organizational cultures that emphasize performance over assumptions. Graduates of the program had gone on to leadership positions in agencies throughout the world, carrying Maya's example as inspiration for evidence-based management practices. Maya herself had been appointed as the director of the federal law enforcement training centers, her responsibilities encompassing training development for all federal law enforcement agencies and coordination with international partners seeking to modernize their own professional development programs. The position represented recognition that her impact had transcended the boundaries of individual achievement to encompass systemic transformation of how governments developed and deployed human resources. The original target from her demonstration remained on display at the Riverside Training Center, now weathered by decades of exhibition, but still clearly showing the 10 holes that had changed everything. Visitors from around the world came to see the artifact that had triggered fundamental changes in how organizations thought about talent recognition, capability assessment, and the hidden costs of assumption-based decision-making. Maya's mother had passed away peacefully 5 years earlier. Her funeral attended by hundreds of law enforcement officers, community leaders, and foundation beneficiaries whose lives had been shaped by the example of service and determination that had characterized the Chen family's American story. Dr. Chen's clinic had been converted into a community health center that continued to serve the immigrant community while providing medical support for law enforcement training programs. Webb, now in his 80s but still sharp as the day he had first approached Maya in the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, served as the unofficial historian of Maya's impact on law enforcement culture. His memoir, Recognizing the Exceptional: How a $10,000 Bet Changed American Policing, had become required reading at police academies throughout the country and a popular selection for leadership development programs in multiple industries. Maya's greatest achievement wasn't her perfect score, Webb wrote in the book's conclusion. It was proving that, Institutional resistance to change could be overcome through demonstrated excellence and patient persistence. She showed us that the most important battles are often fought one shot at a time, one assumption at a time, one institution at a time. Present-day Maya Chen Rodriguez, now retired from federal service, but continuing her work through the foundation and training center that bore her name, stood once again at the Riverside County firing line where her career had been transformed. By 10 perfectly placed shots, the facility had grown far beyond its original boundaries, now encompassing multiple ranges, simulation centers, and classrooms that served law enforcement agencies from around the world. At 62, her hands remained steady and her eyes clear, though she no longer carried her grandfather's Colt except for ceremonial occasions. The weapon rested in its display case, surrounded by letters from officers whose careers had been shaped by her example and photographs of students whose achievements had validated the principles she had spent decades promoting. The morning was crisp and clear, reminiscent of the day that had changed everything 25 years earlier. Maya stood beside her daughter Elena, a 28-year-old FBI agent whose own marksmanship skills had been honed through years of training at the facility that bore her mother's name. Elena carried her great-grandfather's tradition forward, but in her own way, adapting classical techniques to modern challenges and technology. "Tell me again about the bet," Elena said, though she had heard the story countless times throughout her childhood. The request had become a tradition during their monthly visits to the range, a way of connecting past achievements to present responsibilities. Maya smiled, her eyes tracking across the range where hundreds of law enforcement officers had learned that excellence could emerge from unexpected circumstances. "It wasn't really about the money," she replied, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned to see individual events as part of larger patterns. "It was about proving that assumptions can be expensive when they prevent us from recognizing what we need." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The target from that morning remained visible through the museum's glass walls, its 10 holes serving as a permanent reminder that some victories opened doors for generations of people who followed. Maya could see groups of young recruits studying the exhibit, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that she had carried to the range. 25 years earlier, Elena raised her own weapon, a modern pistol that incorporated technological advances that hadn't existed during Maya's early career. But the fundamentals remained unchanged: steady hands, clear mind, honest heart, and the understanding that precision under pressure was as much about character as it was about technique. "Are you ready?" Maya asked, stepping back to observe her daughter's preparation. Elena's response was to settle into the stance that had been passed down through 4 generations of Chen family shooters, her breathing slowing as she found the still point that her great-grandfather had described in broken English, and that her mother had refined through decades of practice and teaching. The first shot cracked across the range with familiar authority, followed by 9 more that spoke of training, dedication, and the understanding that some traditions were worth preserving even as they evolved to meet new challenges. When the string was complete, Elena had duplicated her mother's perfect score, though the accomplishment carried different weight in an era when Maya's achievements had already transformed how organizations thought about talent recognition. 10 for 10, Elena announced, though her tone suggested that the score was less important than the connection to family history and institutional memory that each shot represented. Maya nodded with satisfaction that had less to do with numerical accuracy than with the knowledge that essential principles had been successfully transmitted across generations. The shooting range had become a classroom where lessons about preparation, persistence, and the cost of assumption were taught through demonstration rather than lecture. As they prepared to leave the facility, Maya's phone buzzed with a message from the latest recruit who had been overlooked. by traditional assessment processes, but whose potential had been recognized through the Chen Protocol evaluation system. The young man, a refugee from Somalia whose background bore little resemblance to traditional law enforcement profiles, but whose capabilities under pressure exceeded established benchmarks, would begin training the following week. "Another one?" Alina asked, recognizing the expression that crossed her mother's face when she received updates about recruits whose stories echoed her own experience with institutional resistance and eventual recognition. "Another one," Maya confirmed, her voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication to encompass systemic change that had touched thousands of lives and dozens of organizations. The work continues. They walked toward the parking lot together, passing memorials to officers who had served with distinction and training, facilities that prepared new generations for challenges that would require both traditional skills and innovative approaches. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the range where Maya had first demonstrated that excellence could emerge from unexpected circumstances, and where Alina was now preparing to carry those lessons forward into an uncertain but promising future. The drive home took them past Murphy's Diner, still operating in the same building where Deputy Webb had first suggested that Maya might be ready to show law enforcement what she could do. The parking lot where that conversation had taken place was now marked with a small plaque commemorating the informal networks and individual initiatives that often drove institutional change more effectively than formal policies. Maya's house in East Riverside sat on the same street where she had grown up, though the neighborhood had changed considerably as her success had attracted other families seeking communities that valued achievement over assumptions. The garage that had once served as her training facility was now a study where she worked on research projects and policy recommendations that would shape law enforcement training for decades to come. Alina helped her mother carry equipment into the house, their conversation turning to practical matters of family life and professional responsibilities that had to be balanced against continuing commitments to education and institutional reform. The routines of daily life provided grounding for work that sometimes felt overwhelming in its scope and importance. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd missed that first shot?" Alina asked as they settled into the kitchen where Maya's mother had once served dinners that were conducted in mixtures of Mandarin and English, and where dreams were discussed with the practical determination of people who understood that achievement required both vision and persistence. Maya considered the question while preparing tea. With leaves that had been imported from Taiwan and purchased from the same shop her mother had patronized for 30 years. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But I also think that if I'd been ready to miss, I probably wouldn't have been ready to shoot in the first place." The answer reflected philosophy that had guided Maya's approach to challenges throughout her career, the understanding that preparation and opportunity had to be matched by willingness to accept consequences, whether they involved success that opened new doors or failure that required different strategies for achieving the same goals. As evening settled over Riverside, Maya received calls from former students whose careers were flourishing in departments that had learned to recognize exceptional ability regardless of its packaging. From organizational consultants who were implementing Chen Protocol assessment procedures in industries far removed from law enforcement, and from researchers who were documenting the economic benefits of evidence-based talent recognition practices. Each conversation reinforced the lesson that individual achievements could drive institutional change when they were supported by leaders who understood that competitive advantage often came from challenging established assumptions rather than reinforcing them. Maya's perfect score had been the beginning of a transformation that continued to ripple through organizations and communities that were learning to see potential instead of limiting themselves to familiar patterns. The final call of the evening came from the newest recruit, the young Somali refugee whose background had initially raised questions among traditional assessment Committees but whose capabilities under pressure had impressed evaluators who understood what to look for. His voice carried gratitude that went beyond personal opportunity to encompass recognition that he was part of something larger than individual advancement. "Thank you for making this possible," he said, his accent reflecting the journey that had brought him from a refugee camp in Kenya to a law enforcement training academy in California. "I understand that my opportunity exists because you proved something important about what people can achieve when they're given the chance to show what they can do." Maya's response reflected understanding that her own success had created responsibilities that extended far beyond personal achievement to encompass institutional obligations to identify and develop human potential, regardless of its initial packaging. "Excellence is its own argument," she replied. "Your job is to demonstrate that the principles that open doors for me continue to work for people who come after." After the call ended, Maya sat in the quiet of her kitchen, surrounded by photographs that documented a career built on the foundation of 10 perfectly placed shots and sustained through decades of work to ensure that other exceptional people would have opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. The house was filled with reminders of family history, professional achievements, and ongoing commitments to education and reform that would outlast any individual contribution. Elena joined her mother at the kitchen table, their conversation turning to plans for the Foundation's next scholarship program and training initiatives that would serve communities whose potential had been overlooked by institutions that confused familiarity with competence. The work of transformation was never finished, but it could be sustained through commitment to principles that had been tested by experience and validated by results. Outside, the lights of Riverside stretched toward the horizon, encompassing communities whose young people would benefit from opportunities that hadn't existed before. Maya's demonstration had proved that assumptions could be challenged through evidence and that institutional change was possible when individual excellence demanded recognition. The city had grown and changed, but it remained home to the range where everything had started and the family that continued to carry forward lessons about precision, persistence, and the power of performance to overcome prejudice. As Maya prepared for sleep, she reflected on the morning's shooting session with Elena and the continuing stream of opportunities that emerged from work that had begun with a simple willingness to prove that competence could transcend expectation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new recruits whose potential would require advocacy and development, but tonight brought satisfaction that came from knowing that essential principles had been successfully transmitted to the next generation. Chen family's American story continued to unfold through work that honored the past, while building foundations for futures that would require both traditional skills and innovative approaches to emerging challenges. Maya's grandfather's Colt .45 rested in its display case, no longer active, but continuing to serve as symbol of intergenerational transmission of values and capabilities that connected immigrant dreams to American opportunities. 20-5 years after 10 perfectly placed shots had challenged fundamental assumptions about talent recognition and institutional decision-making, the ripple effects continued to expand through communities and organizations that were learning to see potential instead of limiting themselves to familiar patterns. Maya Chen had proved that excellence could emerge from unexpected circumstances, but more importantly, she had proved that individual achievement could drive systemic change when supported by leaders who understood that competitive advantage often required challenging established assumptions. The target from that morning remained on display at the training center, its 10 holes serving as permanent reminder that some victories opened doors for generations of people who followed. Each hole represented not just technical precision under pressure, but proof that institutional resistance to change could be overcome through demonstrated excellence and patient persistence. Maya's story had become legend within law enforcement circles, but its broader significance lay in the lesson that organizational effectiveness required constant vigilance, against the tendency to mistake familiar patterns for eternal truths. The most important battles were often fought one assumption at a time, one institution at a time, one perfectly placed shot at a time. In the quiet of the night, with Elena sleeping in the room where Maya had once dreamed of opportunities that seemed impossibly distant, the house on the same street where everything had started continued to serve as anchor for work that would outlast any individual contribution. The foundation had been laid through 10 shots that had cost 12 law enforcement officers $10,000 and taught them invaluable lessons about the price of assumption and the value of evidence-based decision-making. The work continued, as it always had and always would, through commitment to principles that had been tested by experience and validated by results that spoke louder than any assumptions about what was possible when preparation met opportunity. And excellence demanded recognition. Maya's legacy lived not just in the records she had set or the institutions she had transformed, but in the understanding that individual achievement could drive systemic change when supported by leaders who understood that the most important victories were often the ones that opened doors for others to follow. The girl who had learned to shoot tin cans behind her uncle's ranch had become a woman whose perfect score had challenged fundamental assumptions about talent recognition and proved that America's promises were real when people were willing to do the work necessary to claim them. The story would continue through Elena and through the countless young people whose opportunities existed because Maya had been willing to prove that competence could transcend expectation and that institutional change was possible when individual excellence demanded recognition. Each new generation would face its own challenges and its own assumptions about what was possible, but they would do so with the knowledge that precision under pressure was achievable through dedication and proper instruction, and that the most important battles were often won one shot at a time.